everyone, welcome to the May 20th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and this is the Preakness Stakes edition of the forecast. So we take a look at the second leg of the Triple Crown this upcoming Saturday. We're going to go through the entire late pick 5 sequence at Pimlico, races 9 through 13, all stakes races, a few graded stakes races in there, culminating with the 13th race on the card, the Preakness, that second jewel of the Triple Crown. Craig, as we've talked about before on this podcast, Rich Strike will not be participating, the Kentucky Derby winner opting to wait for the Belmont Stakes. Hopefully we do see him in that race, but we've got the Derby runner-up Epicenter as the heavy favorite in the Preakness. We did a video on the Preakness for DRF's YouTube channel earlier this week. I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit more later in this podcast, but definitely not the strongest Preakness field that we've ever seen.
No, it's not, and even without Rich Strike, you have to wonder... what would he have been? Fourth choice, maybe fifth choice. So for the race itself, I don't know that it had a huge effect, him not being on there. Of course, fans of the sport, we want to see a horse that won the Derby keep that hopes for the Triple Crown alive. I'm sure the people at Pimlico were disappointed, but from a just handicapping a race perspective, I'm not sure it's really that big of a deal.
Yeah, and we were talking a little bit off air, this pick 5 sequence, it's perhaps not the deepest in terms of how many horses you'd want to use. We'll talk about it a little bit. Some of these races, Craig, there are large fields, but it feels like there are some filler in the races. You can narrow it down to a few runners. We'll see if we agree on which ones as we go through it, but it feels like the kind of sequence where if you are playing it, you probably don't have to craft that large of a ticket.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to play with this one, to be honest. It's one I'm going to wait and see if there's scratches or not. And I'm definitely not going to spend a lot of money on it because to me, it feels like one that could wind up being chalky. There's a couple price horses I like, but not a lot. So we'll just have to see. But, some of the races are still pretty good to talk about, I think, including this first one we're going to get to here in a minute.
Yeah, I agree. And let's dive right into that first leg of the pick 5. Race 9, the grade 3 Chick Lang going 6 furlongs on the main track for the 3-year-olds. And as Craig was alluding to, this is one of the more competitive races on the card on Saturday. And Craig, I think we should start by talking about the pace projector for this race because you've got 4 or 5 horses that want to be towards the front end, if not outright on the lead by themselves. And they can all share that position, and shown in front, kind of between horses, is the number 5, Old Homestead, who's also the 2-1 morning line favorite in this race. This horse is undefeated. He's been impressive in all 3 starts, but I feel like he's going to face a much different situation here than he did in his prior victory at Keeneland.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to play against Old Homestead in here. I think the time to have him was the last time. He had won a couple races easy at Delta going only 5 furlongs, even though he was able to stretch that speed out to 7. I think it's important to note he kind of had things his own way there, and it was a wet track, so I think that had an effect. I mean, it was a $400,000 race. There were some pretty decent horses in there, but this just feels like a spot for me where with all the other speed in there, I want to try to beat him.
Yeah, and one of the main pace rivals for him is going to be a horse breaking from the inside who basically is committed to going from there, and that's the number 1 Cogburn. Craig, I want to get your take on the race that he comes out of with the number 7 Wayland Springs, because Cogburn was defeated as the 3-5 favorite that day in the Bachelor at Oaklawn, but it felt like Wayland Springs just came out with a race that we didn't know he was capable of. He showed a lot of improvement in that race, and I didn't think that Cogburn necessarily lost anything in defeat. He was pretty game running down the stretch. He just ran into a better horse on the day. How did you view Cogburn, and do you think he's the pace horse that you might want if you want any of them in this race?
No, I'm going to use a different pace horse. I think Cogburn's in a really bad spot with Old Homestead to his outside. And like you, I just don't think he had an excuse to lose to Wayland Springs last time. That one surprised everybody. I think he was 7-1 in the race. He's an Arkansas bred who started out his career a bit rough. It took him a while to break his maiden. He was running slow, and then all of a sudden the light just seemed to click, which can happen with 3-year-olds. He got good in a hurry, and, I think he's the real deal. So he's one I'm definitely going to use on my tickets as an A horse. If I were going to use a speed horse in here, I think I would lean towards Little Vic. Now, he did run just 12 days ago, but I like the post draw for him. He's one who had run well as a 2-year-old, and then we didn't see much of him much of him running well early in his 3-year-old year. But the move north up to Monmouth seemed to do the trick. He ran a really fast race that day. And of all the speeds, he just seems to be the one that I think could trip out from the outside and not be forced into a style he doesn't like.
Yeah, if you draw a line through those two route tries for Little Vic, his form definitely looks a little bit more encouraging. And that last race in Monmouth, it looks pretty legit. He beat a decent field that day, and I mean, he beat them pretty soundly. So the speed figure does check out. He got a 117, which I think coming in is the fastest last out TimeformUS speed figure in the race. And like you said, he's drawn to the outside, which is probably where you want to be in a race that's loaded with this much speed. I have to say I'm a little bit concerned about the quick turnaround for a horse coming off a big race like that, and we'll see how much money he takes. I do imagine he'll be the biggest price of those three that we just talked about. Briefly getting back to Cogburn, I just like a horse that maybe could play out as the speed of the speed. I don't know if they're going to be quite as aggressive with Old Homestead here, knowing that there's so much other pace in the race, and it just seems like they're going to have to really send Cogburn from the inside, or Joel Rosario will. The big concern with that Bachelor, Craig, and I guess the same thing with Old Homestead, is they're coming out of races that feature some blue color-coded fractions in the TimeformUS PPs, and feels like they're entering into a race that is definitely going to have some red fractions when this race gets into the charts, and just typically those are bad bets.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's why I haven't got to the horse that's actually my top pick yet. I am going to use Wayland Springs. But the horse I kind of like in here is Chasing Time, the 6 horse. He's coming in for Steve Asmussen out of the Arkansas Derby and the Rebel. He was kind of up close to the pace in those races. He had won at a mile before, but he did so in setting a slow pace. And if you look back at his sprints, they're not too bad at all. And he's definitely one of the horses with some talent that I think doesn't need to be on the lead, and in fact is shown pretty far back on the pace projector. So I like him in here. I think Tyler Gaffalione will give him the right ride, and the 12-1 morning line's obviously appealing to me.
Yeah, I like this horse too. I agree with everything you said about him. He's got the highest TimeformUS late pace rating in the field, which primarily is due to the fact that he's coming out of longer races, and also coupled with the fact that there's no true closing sprinter in this race, so he might fall into that right trip. My one reservation with him is I don't think we're getting anything close to that 12-1 morning line. I'm guessing he'll be half that, maybe around 6-1. He is a My Racehorse runner, so on a big day like this, I would imagine he's going to take a lot of money. But given the pace situation and the fact that I do believe he's a horse that wants to go shorter, I'm not sure that shorter than the 12-1 wouldn't still be a fair price on him. I think somewhere in the 6-7-1 range is okay. So I like Chasing Time as well. I think he makes a certain amount of sense. I kind of wanted to lean on the two Steve Asmussen runners, both him and Cogburn, just believing Cogburn is the most talented of the speed horses, and maybe he shakes loose a little bit and puts the others away, but I do think he could be vulnerable to a late runner. Not against Wayland Springs, just kind of want to see it again because that last race just sticks out so much from his others. And before we move on, Craig, one horse that I just want to give a brief mention to at a price is the number 2 Lightning Larry. He's at least shown the ability to pass horses, and I know he may not have the appealing connections or the credentials of some others in this race, but he's run some decent speed figures. If he's in the 10 to 12-1 range, I don't want to completely dismiss him.
No, not at all. He's a quick horse for sure. He comes out of that Florida bred stakes at Tampa that was pretty quick, and King Cab's not a bad horse at all. So yeah, I wouldn't want to toss him. He has a good, decent outside post position. The horse that finished right behind him has already come back to win with a nice speed figure to kind of validate that race. Another winner from that race, Morgan Point, was behind him as well. So of the prices other than Chasing Time, who I agree, I don't think he's going to be 12-1. He would be one maybe to think about it as a C-type horse for me.
Let's move on to race 10, the James W. Murphy, going a mile on the turf course for the 3-year-olds. And Craig, I want to start the conversation with kind of an odd entrant in this race, the number 10 Joe, who is coming off a game victory in the Federico Tessio last time. He's got some of the fastest speed figures in this race, just having earned them on the dirt. And kind of odd to see him running in this race. I did that DRF live stream last night, as we record this on Thursday night. I did that with Dan Illman, who's very focused on the Maryland circuit. And he was kind of explaining to me that Joe's connections are kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because he can't run in the Sir Barton because he's already a stakes winner, and that's restricted to horses that haven't won a stakes. And they're also reluctant to run in the Preakness because he's not Triple Crown nominated. So they just kind of didn't have a race for him, so they wound up running on the turf. It feels like he could take money. What do you make of a horse like this?
Yeah, I was going to kind of ask you with the breeding with him. I wasn't sure. He's obviously tried turf once in his career debut. Wasn't the greatest trip. It was only at 5.5 furlongs. So I wasn't sure what to do with him. I mean, the 10 post isn't ideal. When you look up his siblings, I guess the one upside would be that they both perform better. Or he only shows 2 in our past performances, and they both perform better on synthetics and turf. One of his siblings, Irony of Reality, was actually graded stakes placed at Tampa. He was 50-1 in that race, but he actually seemed to be a decent runner on turf. So I wasn't sure what to make with him either. I think I'm going to use him tepidly in here just because... although I'm a little less enthusiastic after what Dan has said, that they're just kind of, it seems like they just want to run on Preakness Day. Because as you mentioned, I think you mentioned, he did win an entry to the Preakness, but obviously you still have to pay the fees to nominate, I guess, and they didn't want to do that. So yeah, he's the one horse I just wasn't sure what to do with, and was hoping you could help me out with the breeding aspect.
Yeah, I kind of feel like they maybe should have run in the Peter Pan last week at Belmont. That might have been a better spot for him. But they wind up on the turf here. He is a Maryland bred, so I guess they want to run in Maryland. As far from the breeding standpoint, I think you summed it up. I mean, he's got the pedigree for his racetrack ability to go either way with regard to surface. His sibling could run on turf and synth. He's by declaration of war. He did run on the turf before, but it was going 5.5 furlongs in his career debut at Laurel. And clearly 5.5 furlongs is just way too short for this horse. Watching the way that he runs, kind of lowering his head with that big stride, I wouldn't be surprised if he can transfer to turf. But I think just in general, Craig, horses like this that are sure to take money off dirt form are typically bad bets, because you want these horses that have some turf move up pedigree, that don't have the dirt races that are going to attract a lot of bettors into their corner. And I feel like he does. So I kind of wanted to veer away from him, though I get that he can win this race, and I wouldn't want to completely leave him off my tickets. The other horse that has some dirt credentials, Shake 'em Loose, he just doesn't really have much turf pedigree. He did no running in his prior turf race, so I'm definitely more negative on him than I am on Joe. They are the top 2 TimeformUS power picks, just kind of looking at my PPs on the screen here, which isn't surprising because they have the best speed figures, but I feel like some of the turf horses might be where you want to go here. And one of the ones that's likely to take a lot of money is the number 5, Ready to Perform. I'm curious what you make of this horse, Craig, because he was visually impressive when he won that Laurel Futurity last year in October. But in retrospect, didn't he kind of have everything go his way that day with the fast pace?
He did, but I would also add, as a 2-year-old, that's still pretty impressive to me. You don't see a lot of 2-year-olds able to come from that far back. He didn't run very well at Del Mar, but it's kind of a different world out there. Some horses take to it, some don't. It's a different kind of turf racing, and I think he's a pretty strong contender in here. I mean, he gets Florent Giroux for Brad Cox. The speed figures might look a little light, but the one thing I'd say is he's one of the few horses that has shown he can win going 2 turns. A lot of these horses are coming out of sprints. A big part of that is because in Maryland, once Laurel closes, they shut the turf course down pretty early last year, and there was just nowhere for these horses to run. So you'll see a lot of horses on the turf, or turf horses who have been running on the dirt. They've run a lot of sprints since they've come back, opening it up. So it's a really tough race for me to get a read on. But I do think Ready to Perform has a pretty big shot in here.
Yeah, and the other horse with the obvious turf credentials that I think is going to take some money is the number 7 Riot House. This horse, began his career sprinting for Wesley Ward, but this ownership group, or this owner, they switched horses away from Wesley Ward. I've noticed a few other runners that in their barn now going out for different trainers. This one is now with Danny Gargan, and his last couple of starts, both going 2 turns at Gulfstream, kind of suggests that maybe he wanted to go longer all along, because he definitely improved in those races. My issue with Riot House is that, and we've talked about this before, Craig, some of those Gulfstream allowance and maiden races this season aren't as strong as we had seen in the past, and I wonder if he really has been facing the toughest fields down there.
Yeah, I don't like Riot House in this spot. Of the 2 morning line favorites, I much prefer Ready to Perform. And I'd look elsewhere for a different horse to use. The horse that kind of jumped out at me was the horse distance I've Ready to Perform, and that's Wow What a Summer. He's a big price on the morning line. And he's one of those horses that came back in a turf sprint at Laurel back in April, showed a big close to get third, but he's one who at least had run longer and run okay. So of the others, if I had to pick one price horse in here, it would be him, just because I like how he finished off of the race at a distance that I think is just probably too short for him.
I've got a different price horse, Craig. To your Wow What a Summer, I'm going to go with the horse that actually beat him when they both tried turf last year at Colonial Downs in that August 2nd Hickory Tree. That's Locomotive. He won that day, and that was actually the only turf race that Locomotive's ever run in. Since then, he's improved, but he's done so on dirt and stretching out in distance. I like that his last couple races, his speed figures have kind of ticked up a little bit, and that says to me that maybe he just wanted to go longer all along. Maybe now that he's a more mature horse, he can handle the longer distances. And that turf speed figure, while it's much lower from last summer, it was kind of in line with his other races at the time. And now that he's shown the ability to go longer, I like that they're giving him the chance to get back on the turf. His pedigree, it might not be super obvious turf breeding, but Divining Rod, he's a new sire that I'm not going to be at all surprised when he starts to throw some turf runners, because Divining Rod, some pedigree aficionados might know, is a very close sibling, or close relative, I should say, to Kitten's Joy. And on the dam side, he's got Not for Love, who, as a Maryland sire, a lot of people know is a good dirt and turf influence. So I think that Locomotive is an interesting price horse in this race, and he'd be the one that I would try to get in there to create some value.
Yeah, he's the third horse I'm going to use for all the reasons you mentioned. About the only point I was going to bring up was the speed figure, that I don't think it really matters because it came so early in that 2-year-old season. So yeah, for me, it will be Locomotive, Wow What a Summer, Ready to Perform, and maybe just a little bit of Joe back as like a C type.
Let's move on to the 11th race, the Sir Barton Stakes, sticking with the 3-year-olds, but switching back over to the main track, going 1 mile and a 16th. And Craig, we've got some intriguing runners in this race. Maybe first and foremost among them, the number 5, B Doc, who was coming off a very impressive 11-length maiden victory at Keeneland, in which he got a 112 TimeformUS speed figure, but a 118 final time number for that race. Just a huge number for a maiden victory. I don't really know where that came from, and if he can repeat it going 2 turns in a race with plenty of other speed, but I think he's a horse that you have to have an opinion about going into this, Sir Barton.
Yeah, I'm going to use him. I couldn't find anything negative. It was one I looked to make sure it wasn't one of those days where speed was really good at Keeneland. And in fact, it was almost the opposite, where there were a couple deep closers win that day. So, it was his first time the about 7.5 is almost, or the about 7 furlongs is more than 7.25 furlongs. So maybe it was just the case that he's always wanted more distance, and the 2 turns would be fine. I mean, Gormley certainly was fine around 2 turns. He's out of a Super Saver mare. So I think you got to respect him in here, and I'm definitely going to use him if I play this sequence.
Yeah, the other horse that is probably considered the main player in this race would be the number 1, Ethereal Road. Even if he wins on Preakness Day, Craig, I'm not sure he's going to create as big of an impact as he did on Kentucky Derby Day, when it was his lack of presence in the starting gate that allowed Rich Strike to win the Kentucky Derby, as he was that late scratch that allowed the number 21 to get into the race. He's definitely a horse that should be suited by some pace if it develops here. The pace projector does indicate that they're likely to be moving up front. There's plenty of speed to the outside. I just feel like this horse has kind of hit a little bit of a plateau with regard to his speed figures, and he's never really taken that step forward that you would have expected after he ran that good race in the Rebel.
Yeah, I know we both actually liked him in the Rebel. It was disappointing to see him get run down by Unoho, and he really hasn't went forward at all. He just kind of keeps running the same speed figures. I do kind of think it's important to note that he did miss a workout. He came back to work pretty well last week, but he did miss one in the interim. So I don't think they just scratched because they didn't want to run in the Derby. It seems like maybe something was amiss. So at a short price and a horse who doesn't have a lot of early speed, he's one that I don't even know if I want to use him in here in this sequence.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I was thinking about where I would like to see this horse because it feels like they're banging their head against the wall trying to run in these Derby preps. And I would have loved to pick him in the Chick Lang because he's a horse that actually has a lot of sprint pedigree on the bottom side. And he's the kind of horse that I would like to see turned back eventually. I'm not, contrary to what you might think, I'm not sure that longer is necessarily better with Ethereal Road. We'll see about that. I know they talked about maybe running him in the Belmont if he does well here. Let's talk about some other horses in this race, Craig. I did mention the pace projector. It's got the red flag for a fast pace, which is not a big surprise with horses like Uniki drawn to the outside. He's the one that's shown leading the way early over B Doc. Uniki, kind of in a similar situation, is a horse that's done really well sprinting and has earned some nice speed figures, but personally, when I watch this horse's races, I'm even less confident with him stretching out than I would be with B Doc.
Yeah, of the two, I much prefer B Dog. I know we've talked about Uniki many times because his maiden race was a big key race at Gulfstream, but he's never screamed two-turn horse to me, and I do think there's some other speed in here, maybe even some better speed, not necessarily to get the lead, but horses that I think are better horses around two turns. So I'm glad to hear you say that. I was thinking you might come on and say you like him at two turns. I didn't really know what you'd think, but I was hoping you wouldn't. So I'm glad to hear that you don't. And now that I mentioned the other speeds, there's one in here at a price that I did want to talk about. Now, I'm not sure we're going to get 15-1, but I think Good Skate is a horse who's shipping down from Aqueduct. And I think his last race is a lot better than it looks on paper. The horse he dueled with that day, Electability, is a horse who, or he didn't duel with him, but he was right up front with him, is a horse who is obviously pretty good. He came back to run decent in the Peter Pan, a good third. And I just like what I saw from Good Skate that day. I think he kind of stepped up. If you look at the track ratings that we have in Timeform US, he really seemed to improve. Even though he was winning, his speed figure went up quite a bit in that race when he ran over a more normal track at Aqueduct in April than what we usually see in the winter. So of the other horses, he's the one price horse that kind of interests me in here.
Yeah, I mean, he's shown second on the pace projector, but he's a horse that doesn't need to be on the lead. I don't think he's rarely been on the lead by himself. He wants to be more of the stalking type, sitting in behind the leaders. And yeah, I don't know how far he can take this run of improvement that he's had going for him. He's definitely on an upward trajectory. He's a horse that I think his connections were surprised by because they risked him for much lower claiming tags many times early in his career, and he kind of just ran his way out of those races by continuing to do well. So we'll see how far he can take that improvement. But like you said, he's 15-1 on the morning line, and it's not like he's completely out of this with regard to, the speed figures that he's running. He's running as fast as some others. They're going to be much shorter prices. I've got a horse, Craig, that I like that has also raced for a tag before, and that's the number 9 Brooklyn Diamonds. I think he's pretty interesting. If this pace does come apart a little bit, which I think is a possibility, this horse wants to come from off the pace. He made a big late run to get up going 6 furlongs in his debut for the $75,000 tag at Oaklawn, but he struck me as one watching him that day as a horse that would want to go longer. They stretched him out in his second start, and he ran a similar speed figure, but I liked what I saw. Even though he lost that race, he kind of maybe seemed to get discouraged racing over that muddy track, coming around the far turn, taking a lot of kickback. But once he got out into the clear, he just kind of kept plugging away, eventually separated from the third place finisher. I thought he was finishing best of all across the wire. And he just strikes me as one that really is going to relish the 2-turn trips down the line. He's a horse that has a lot of pedigree. He actually started out in Bob Baffert's barn. He was training with some Baffert horses over the winter, but I guess wasn't doing well enough, so they transferred him to Rodolphe Brissett before his debut. But I feel like maybe he's just one that was a little bit slower to come along, and the fact that now he's getting the chance to try Stakes Company and will be a decent price in a race that features a lot of pace, he's one that I would want to focus on in here.
I got no problem with him. And one more I want to throw out before we move on is the 4-horse at the Addison Poor. It's a horse who he's just improved every single time out. He got up to win last time for Brittany Russell. She always spots her races well. And in a race that could get hot up front, looking at some of the speed in here, he seems to have a nice closing kick to him. So at a big price, he's one I would want to have on my tickets as well.
Let's move on to the penultimate leg of this pick 5 sequence, the Jim McKay turf sprint, going the 5 furlong distance on that turf course at Pimlico. And Craig, the center of this race is obviously the number 2 Caratari. He is way the horse to beat. He's coming off some pretty nice speed figures. One of them earned down at Gulfstream, where he typically runs some of his best races, but the 5 furlong distance as opposed to 5.5 or 6, it really seems like that is right in this horse's wheelhouse. He wants to go in these shorter races and just flaunt a lot of speed, and he typically can do it for the entire 5 furlong distance. He's way the horse to beat. I think it's just a question of how short a price you want to take.
Yeah, it's hard to get past him in here. I don't think I could play this ticket if I didn't have him on there, because he just kind of looks like the best horse in the field. He runs the best speed figures. The 5 furlong distance is perfect. I guess the one knock you could have on him is he's coming off a little bit of a layoff, and a couple times before when he's come off similar layoffs, he's run second, but he's ran fine. So it just seems like tough. He's a tough in this spot, so he would be an A horse for me. And a lot of that's just because I couldn't find a lot of other competition in here. I guess if I was going to use one other horse, it would be the horse right to his outside, 7 Cents, who won a nice allowance race for Brad Cox off the $80,000 claim. Ran a speed figure, which is just a few points below Caratari. So he's one I guess you would want to give a shot. I'm not sure if the 5 I know he's won at 5 furlongs, but he seems to be a little better horse to me at the 5.5. But if I had to use one other, it would be him. So I don't have anything too clever in here. The one horse I did kind of want to point out, not as a horse I like handicapping, but I saw my old buddy Arthur's Hope in here from long ago. I've liked him many times in the past, but it's kind of interesting to see an 8-year-old with 45 starts who has never run on the turf before.
The one thing I will say about Arthur's Hope is that even though he's never run on the turf, his sire, Smart Bid, was strictly a turf horse. For whatever that's worth, if you want to look up his PPs, he was very good on the turf. Not that Smart Bid has been some kind of fantastic sire with any horse running on any surface other than Arthur's Hope. But for whatever it's worth, he does have that little bit of pedigree on the top side. Craig, yeah, you brought up the 7 Cents as one of the alternatives to Caratari, and I would counter that with saying, going back to watch that Keeneland allowance race that he comes out of, I thought that number 5, Mr. Hustle, is coming out of the same race, arguably ran just as well as 7 Cents. 7 Cents got a perfect trip that day, stalking on the inside and peeling out when they got into the stretch after having saved all the ground. And Mr. Hustle, it's not like he was wide on the turn. He was also inside, but when he came out to make his run in the stretch, he got into some traffic, got cut off between horses, had to come around, and was still finishing even after getting his momentum stopped. Watching that race, I felt like Mr. Hustle was the one that you wanted out of there, and he's got some decent prior turf form or turf sprint form when he tried some stakes behind Just Might at the fairgrounds. So I feel like he's got some sneaky form coming in here, and if he's going to be a much bigger price, he'd be one that I want to use. And the other horse that I kind of latched onto as a horse that I thought I could use in tandem with Caratari is the number 7, Grateful Bread. He's kind of the local star turf sprinter in Maryland. He's done a lot of winning on that circuit against lesser competition, other Maryland breds, but even though he's coming in a little bit light on speed figures, I want to highlight a couple things. This is just a horse that tries really hard. When you watch his races, you can see he lowers his head. He really just gives his best effort every time. I like, honest horses like that in these turf sprints because sometimes they can outrun their odds a little bit. And also, he's a horse that I think is really suited by the 5 furlongs. He's only done this twice, go at Pimlico, going the flat 5 furlong distance, but both of those efforts have been pretty impressive. So even though he's not quite as fast as Caratari, I'm not going to be surprised when he just kind of grits out a better performance than maybe his PPs could indicate. So Grateful Bread is the one that I would want to use prominently. Also using Caratari and Mr. Hustle as a bit of a backup.
Yeah, and I will say that Grateful Bread, the one thing I like to see in these 5 furlong sprints is he's pretty versatile. He's went wire to wire. He's come from off the pace before. He's never going to come from 10 lengths back, but he's a horse who's comfortable sitting 1, 2, even 3 lengths back and can still run a good race.
We should give a brief mention to Hollis, Craig, because he's got a lot of speed and could be the one that kind of messes up Caratari on the front end. And Hollis, you'll probably remember, he actually won this race back in 2020 over a boggy course at Pimlico when they had taken a lot of rain on Preakness week. Do you think this horse can finally transfer his form back to turf again, or is he just kind of seen better days?
Yeah, he was a tough read for me. The problem I have with him is his last 2 tries on turf have been on decent turf courses, and they're mixed in amongst some really good dirt races. And he just doesn't seem to want to run on it anymore. I couldn't blame anybody for hoping maybe he just likes the Pimlico course because he did win this race a couple years ago, as you said. But that course was really boggy, as you say. It was just a crazy course. If it wasn't Preakness Day, or there's no chance they would have ran this race on the turf that day. So I'm more likely to toss him out. But I could see where maybe people grasping for straws would gravitate to him. But the thing I would point out is I don't think he's going to be that big of a price anyway. He's 6-1 on the morning line. That wouldn't be enough to make me bite, and I suspect he'll get bet even lower than that.
Let's move on to the final leg of this sequence, the final thoroughbred race on Saturday at Pimlico. It is the Grade 1 Preakness, second jewel of the Triple Crown, going the mile and 3/16 distance. And Craig, we've already talked about this one a little bit, on our video that we did earlier this week. But let's kind of summarize our thoughts. Epicenter, clearly the horse to beat. Probably going to be a very short price, even money, 4 to 5. We could both see him going that low. I think that nobody's arguing that he ran the best race in the Derby. It's just a matter of how much better you think he really is than the other main rivals that he's facing in this Preakness.
Yeah, and we talked about it. I don't know that he's that much better. The speed figures certainly don't seem to indicate it. His Preakness figure came back a 120 with just a little bit of a pace adjustment. I think people are getting a little carried away talking about how involved he was in the pace because, frankly, he wasn't. He kind of inherited the lead when all the speed horses backed out. Now, he did move sooner than the other horses who were coming from behind, so maybe it was a little bit of a disadvantage, but I would argue he had a pretty darn good trip in the Derby. So when you look at some of the others in here, the speed figure isn't that different. Early voting ran a nice 121 in the Wood. I have talked about that race. It was a very tough day to make speed figures. So if people want to say maybe that race should be 5 points lower, I don't have an argument with that. But early voting's also going to be out front all by himself, in my opinion, and the opinion of the pace projector. He's a fast horse, and so he could contend. Secret Oath is a horse who she won the Oaks with a 116 speed figure, just a few points below. And even Simplification ran a decent race in the Derby to get a 115. So I don't think it's the layover that a lot of people are making it look like.
Yeah, Craig, I know you picked early voting in this race, and you don't sound too concerned about him getting pressure on the front end here. And as you said, the pace projector agrees. I mean, he is a very fast horse, not only in the early stages of his races, but also out of the gate. He's got a very quick start reaction time. We saw it in the Wood. We saw it too back in the Withers. I mean, if they want the lead with him, they can get it. I've seen a lot of chatter about horses that might be able to challenge him early, but based on pace figures, that doesn't seem so likely. I mean, I've seen some people say that Fenwick could be a horse that could be aggressively ridden in here. The same thing about Armagnac, but they just don't look like they're as fast as early voting. So if they want to get that leading trip, they're going to be able to do it.
Yeah, that's what I would think. I mean, Armagnac, we saw what happened when he ran against faster horses like Forbidden Kingdom, who set similar pace figures to what I expect from early voting, and he was just nowhere to be found. He couldn't even pressure him in those races. So I don't think so. And Fenwick, come on. He's not he's not pressuring a horse like early voting, in my opinion. If he does, it would mean he was quarter horsed out of the gate by Florent Giroux, and I just don't see that happening. So I just think it's a matter of early voting can fend off a horse like Epicenter, and when that one decides to challenge, because I think he will be the one tracking him, and we'll have to decide when to make that move and just how soon it will be, and if it could set it up for maybe some of the closers like Simplification or Secret Oath.
Yeah, we have similar feelings about those three favorites. I went in a slightly different direction by putting Simplification on top, and it's just purely a value play with Simplification. Just kind of going through this race, I had trouble swallowing short prices on Epicenter or even prices around 7-2 or 4-1 on early voting and Secret Oath. I don't quite buy that they're good enough to beat Epicenter. And I went more in the direction of what if Epicenter takes a slight step backwards off the Derby, because he was cranked up to win that race. He arguably ran a winning race, just didn't quite get the job done. And it's no guarantee that these horses are going to maintain their peak form forever. So if Epicenter does take that step backwards, it opens the race up to who? Well, obviously early voting and Secret Oath, but I feel like they're the obvious two alternatives. And Simplification, look, he did not run as well as Epicenter in the Kentucky Derby. He didn't run as well as a couple of others, the two horses that finished ahead of him, Xandon and Rich Strike. He got a great ride from Jose Ortiz that day, but I think that he's a horse that gives his rider a lot of options because he has that versatility. When he broke slowly in that Holy Bull earlier in the year, it kind of showed his connections that he's actually fine coming from off the pace, and they've used that as an option in their last few races with him. Some people I saw were asking on Twitter why he's shown so far back on the pace projector. I think he's shown in last or second to last early, and that's because in 3 of his last 4 races, he's been ridden as a closer. But he is a horse that still possesses that tactical speed. We saw it too back in the Florida Derby when they used it, and he kind of got involved in a pace that was a little bit too fast for him, and he faded late. But he does have that at his disposal, and I think breaking from the rail here, John Velasquez is probably going to get him into a more forward position than we saw in the Derby last time. Not saying that he's the one that's going to challenge early voting for the lead, but I think he's going to try to get into that pocket and behind the leaders, and that's a trip that I think could work out for Simplification. And if Epicenter takes that step backwards, Simplification has proven that he has the races that are just as good as Secret Oath and early voting, maybe not with the upside of those horses, but he's going to be a much bigger price. I think he's going to drift up from that 6-1 morning line, maybe to the 8-1 range, and that's good enough value for me.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. And just wanted to mention the pace projector. Sometimes I think people don't get the reason it's there. It's not so much we're not carving in stone where we think the horses are going to be. We're telling you how they've run their last several races, how they've run it early, where they've been, and how fast they've run, and where that puts them in this field. But as you say, I mean, we want the handicappers to look, and obviously Simplification's a horse who can show speed. He went wire to wire in the Mucho Macho Man. As you said, in the Florida Derby, he tracked pressed a really quick pace, and I know we both thought he ran the better race in the Florida Derby. So it's he's one of those horses that's tricky because he's versatile. So they're always going to be a little trickier for that pace projector, but there's nothing wrong with him being at the back because that's how he's been running, as you say.
Well, Craig, that wraps up the pick 5 sequence. Let's do a brief recap. I know you said that you weren't super excited about playing this one. If you were going to recommend that somebody play it, how would you kind of go about the strategy?
I would make sure that I'm not going to play any tickets with more than 2 favorites on them. That might involve using the ticket maker and crafting 5 or 6 tickets. They would all be pretty cheap tickets, but I would want to make sure that I hit some prices if I do. And a couple of those prices, like I said, I like Chasing Time in the 6, or in race 9, the 6 horse. I don't expect that 12 to morning line, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was a 6-1 or 8-1 type horse. In the which one is it? The James Murphy. I like Wow What a Summer as a price horse. I would definitely use him. Locomotive, who you liked, who had won his lone turf start, I would use him, so he'd be a price horse I'd try to get in In the 11th, the Addison Poor was one that I liked at a price. You like Brooklyn Diamond, so I would have no problem with that one at all. The 12th, I would probably be pretty narrow. I would be with the shorter horses, Caratori, 7 cents. I have no problem with Mr. Hustle, who you mentioned. I personally wouldn't use Grateful Bread. I think he probably will run well, but I didn't really see him as a win contender. And in the Preakness, I would stay away from using Epicenter and except in tickets with those other long prices, and kind of concentrate on early voting, simple secret oath, and even simplification a little bit. But yeah, that would be my strategy. Play multiple tickets with making sure I don't load up where if 3 or 4 favorites win, I don't want to cash.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about trying to navigate the minefield of favorites that would be potentially coming in during the sequence, and having a ticket that you think is worth playing for less money by not including all of those favorites to kind of beef up the price of your total play. And we've got a similar strategy here, Craig. I would be spreading most in the Chick Lang, using both Steve Asmussen runners, Cogburn and Chasing Time, if they're the two that I like the most, but I could also use a long shot like Lightning Larry, the number 7 Wayland Springs. I want to have them on my tickets. The horse I don't want on my tickets is the number 5 Old Homestead. If he wins, I would lose in the first leg. Race 10, the James Murphy. I like Locomotive, and he's a horse that I would have as an A in an ABC kind of ticket, because I do think he's going to be a value, and that makes him worthy for me in this race of using him prominently, because I'm just a little bit iffy on all the others that are likely to take money. The 5, 7, and 10 ready to perform, Riot House and Joe. I'm not, going to throw them off my tickets, but I definitely would want to have them on lower rungs. The 11th race, the Sir Barton, I like Brooklyn Diamonds, as you kind of mentioned. He's another horse that I would use as an A at a price, and the backups for me would be those horses like Ethereal Road, who I think can win given the pace situation, but didn't want to place all my faith in him. And a horse we didn't mention, the number 6, Mr. Jefferson, a horse that I also think could benefit from pace and is worth using on a pick 5 type wager. The 12th race, the Turf Spread, Karatari's way the horse to beat. I'd use him along with Grateful Bread, probably in a 2A situation, because I don't want to take a big stand against Karatari, and a slight backup with the number 5, Mr. Hustle, who I do think will be a price. And then closing things out, I'm gonna lean a little bit on simplification. As you were saying, Craig, not that I'm way against Epicenter, but just from a value standpoint, I want to demote Epicenter a little bit, because my strategy in playing this sequence is to try to beat him with a horse like Simplification, who I think is going to be fair odds and probably very good value in a bet like the pick 5. So he'd be my A in the Preakness.
The one price horse I forgot to mention was in the Sir Barton. I actually do like Good Skate quite a bit as well.
Well, that's our take on the Preakness. Craig, we will try to find some time next week to record a recap of this. I've got kind of a crazy schedule the next few days. I'm actually moving to a different apartment, so my belongings might be all over the place, but it's not a visual show, so we'll try to find some time to record our Preakness recap next week when we do the TimeformUS Pacecast. Good luck to you if you're playing the races this weekend. Remember, you can always check out these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to catch that TimeformUS Pacecast next week.